In the autumn of 52 BCE, deep in the heart of central Gaul, a fortress stood atop a high plateau like a stone crown above the surrounding plains. The stronghold of Alesia overlooked valleys and rivers that had guarded it for generations, and within its walls tens of thousands of warriors waited. They were led by a young and determined chieftain who had achieved something that had once seemed impossible. He had united the fiercely independent tribes of Gaul under a single banner. Inside that fortress burned a single hope, that this place would become the turning point in their struggle for freedom. But beyond the hill, the ground told a different story. Across the open fields below, Roman soldiers were hard at work. 8 hardened legions under the command of Julius Caesar dug trenches into the earth and raised towering walls of timber and packed soil. Mile after mile, their fortifications crept around the hilltop fortress in a tightening ring. This was no ordinary siege. Caesar was not simply surrounding Alesia, he was sealing it off from the world. Then the news arrived that changed everything. Scouts reported that a massive relief army was marching toward Alesia, an army drawn from tribes across Gaul, perhaps hundreds of thousands strong. They were coming to break the siege and crush the Romans between two forces, one trapped inside the fortress, the other advancing across the plains. Suddenly the balance of power shifted. Caesar had trapped an enemy army within Alesia, but now he faced a far greater danger. His legions stood between two massive armies, outnumbered and with nowhere to retreat. The question that hung over the battlefield was simple, yet terrifying. Could Caesar survive being caught between them, or would this hill in Gaul become the grave of Rome's greatest commander? By the time the armies gathered around Alesia in 52 BCE, the conflict had already been burning for years. What began as a limited military intervention had slowly transformed into one of the most ambitious campaigns in the history of the Roman Republic. For nearly 7 years, Julius Caesar had marched his legions across the vast and rugged lands of Gaul. At first, the mission was framed as a defensive operation, to protect Rome's allies from hostile tribes and stabilize the northern frontier. But campaigns have a way of growing once victory begins to pile up. With each passing year, Caesar pushed deeper into Gaul, defeating tribe after tribe with a combination of discipline, engineering, and relentless strategy. Roman legions brought with them a system of warfare unlike anything the tribes had faced before. Their armies moved like machines, building roads, bridges, and fortified camps almost overnight. In battle, their formations held steady even under intense pressure. One by one, many Gallic tribes were forced into submission. Wealth flowed south to Rome, grain, gold, and slaves, while Caesar's reputation grew larger with every victory. Yet beneath the surface of these triumphs, resentment was quietly building. Among the tribes of Gaul, few figures would emerge more dramatically than a young nobleman named Vercingetorix. Born into the powerful Arvernian tribe, he possessed both political instinct and a fierce determination to resist Roman domination. While many tribal leaders had chosen to cooperate with Rome, Vercingetorix saw the growing Roman presence for what it truly was: the slow conquest of an entire civilization. What made him different from earlier leaders was not simply courage, it was vision. For centuries, the tribes of Gaul had fought each other as often as they fought outsiders. Rivalries, grudges, and shifting alliances had kept them divided. Vercingetorix understood that as long as the tribes remained fragmented, Rome would always defeat them one by one. So he did something unprecedented. He began calling for unity. Against all odds, his message spread. Tribe after tribe answered his call, setting aside old rivalries in the face of a greater threat. For the first time, much of Gaul recognized a single war leader. It was a moment that deeply alarmed Roman commanders. A united Gaul was far more dangerous than a divided one. But Vercingetorix also understood that facing the Roman legions in open battle would likely end in disaster. Instead, he adopted a far more painful strategy, one that required sacrifice from his own people. Villages were burned, fields destroyed, and food supplies removed before Roman forces could reach them. By denying Caesar's army the ability to live off the land, he hoped to stretch Roman supply lines and exhaust the invaders. This scorched earth strategy worked better than many expected. Roman troops marched through landscapes stripped bare, where every mile demanded more resources and every supply convoy became vulnerable. The campaign slowed, and the war became a test of endurance. Still, Caesar was not a commander easily cornered. Eventually, he found an opportunity at the wealthy Gallic city of Avaricum. Unlike other towns that had been abandoned or burned, Avaricum remained intact, its granaries filled with food. Caesar laid siege, and when the walls finally fell, the result was devastating. Roman soldiers stormed the city, killing tens of thousands and seizing the supplies that would sustain the campaign. The fall of Avaricum was both a victory and a warning. It showed the brutal efficiency of Roman warfare, but it also hardened Gallic resistance. The conflict was no longer a series of tribal uprisings. It had become a struggle for survival. And the man leading that resistance, Vercingetorix, was about to lead his people into the defining confrontation of the entire war. The road to Alesia was not paved with easy victories. By the time the campaign reached its final stage, the war in Gaul had entered its most dangerous phase for Rome. For years, Julius Caesar had dominated the battlefield with an almost uninterrupted series of successes. His legions had defeated larger armies, crossed impossible terrain, and subdued tribe after tribe. But war has a way of turning when confidence grows too strong, and in the spring of 52 BCE, Caesar encountered a harsh reminder that his enemies were learning. That moment came at the hilltop stronghold of Gergovia. Perched high above the surrounding countryside, the fortress belonged to the powerful Arvernian tribe, the very people who had rallied behind Vercingetorix. Unlike previous engagements, the terrain here favored the defenders completely. Roman forces were forced to attack uphill against fortified positions while Gallic warriors rained down missiles from above. In the confusion of battle, Roman units advanced farther than planned, becoming isolated and vulnerable. What followed was something rare in Caesar's campaigns, a clear and painful setback. His legions were driven back with heavy casualties, and for the first time during the Gallic War, Rome tasted a significant defeat. News of that victory spread quickly across Gaul. Tribes that had previously submitted to Roman authority began to reconsider their loyalties. If Caesar could be beaten once, perhaps he could be beaten again. The rebellion that Vercingetorix had ignited now began to grow into something much larger. Messengers traveled across forests, rivers, and mountain passes, calling warriors from distant tribes to join the fight. What had once been scattered resistance slowly transformed into a massive coalition united by a single purpose: driving the Romans out of Gaul. Yet even in this moment of growing strength, the balance of the war remained fragile. Vercingetorix understood that his advantage depended on avoiding large-scale battles with the Roman legions. His strategy of attrition had worked precisely because it forced Caesar to chase him across difficult terrain while denying the Romans easy victories. But maintaining that strategy required patience, and patience can be difficult to sustain when momentum begins to shift. At one critical moment, the two sides clashed in a fierce cavalry engagement. Roman horsemen, supported by experienced Germanic auxiliaries, met the Gallic cavalry in open ground. The result was decisive. The Gallic riders were scattered, their lines collapsing under the disciplined charges of the Roman and Germanic cavalry. Suddenly, the advantage that Vercingetorix had carefully built began to slip away. Recognizing the danger, he made a strategic decision. Rather than risk another open confrontation, he pulled his forces back and searched for a position where he could hold out long enough for reinforcements to gather. That place would be Alesia. Located atop a high plateau surrounded by steep valleys and natural barriers, it offered the kind of defensive position that could neutralize Roman battlefield superiority. With thousands of warriors and civilians behind its walls, Alesia became the focal point of the entire conflict. Vercingetorix believed that if he could hold the fortress long enough, a massive relief army drawn from tribes across Gaul would arrive to break the Roman siege. It was a gamble built on timing and unity. But as both sides moved toward the hilltop stronghold, the tension of the war reached a new level. The stage was set for one of the most extraordinary sieges in ancient history. When Julius Caesar first studied the landscape around the hill fortress of Alesia, he faced a decision that would define the entire campaign. The stronghold stood atop a plateau surrounded by steep valleys and rivers, its slopes forming a natural defensive barrier. Any direct assault would cost thousands of Roman lives, and even then success was far from guaranteed. Caesar understood that brute force would not win this battle. If Alesia was to fall, it would be through patience, engineering, and strategy. So instead of attacking the walls, he decided to build his own. The first stage of the operation was the construction of a massive ring of fortifications designed to seal the fortress completely. Roman soldiers began digging trenches and raising walls around the plateau, creating what historians call a circumvallation line. This barrier stretched for roughly 11 miles, encircling Alesia like a tightening iron band. The structure was built from packed earth reinforced with timber, rising nearly 10 feet high. Every 80 feet, wooden towers were erected so that archers and artillery crews could watch the surrounding terrain and rain missiles down on any attackers. But Caesar knew the Gauls would not simply sit and starve. Somewhere beyond the horizon, tribal leaders were gathering a massive relief army that would eventually march to break the siege. When that army arrived, the Romans would face a terrifying scenario: an attack from the outside while the trapped warriors inside Alesia surged forward to strike from within. To prepare for that moment, Caesar ordered something unprecedented. A second line of fortifications began rising beyond the first, this time facing outward toward the open countryside. This defensive ring, known as the Contravallation Line, stretched nearly 14 miles. With this structure, Caesar effectively turned his army into the center of a fortified island surrounded by walls on both sides. Inside the inner wall, Roman soldiers held the Gauls of Alesia captive. Outside the outer wall, they prepared to resist the approaching relief army. Between these lines of earthworks and towers, nearly 50,000 Roman troops lived and worked in fortified camps. Roads connected the different sectors so reinforcements could move quickly wherever the line came under attack. It was an extraordinary display of Roman military engineering, carried out with the methodical discipline that had made the legions famous across the ancient world. Yet the defenses did not stop with walls. In front of the fortifications, Roman soldiers created layers of deadly obstacles designed to slow and break any assault. They dug deep pits with sharpened stakes at the bottom and carefully concealed them with branches and soil. Rows of angled wooden spikes were driven into the ground, ready to impale charging warriors. In open areas, iron-tipped stakes were hidden just beneath the surface, capable of crippling horses and tearing through advancing infantry. These traps transformed the fields around Alesia into a deadly maze. Watching from the fortress above, Vercingetorix realized exactly what Caesar was attempting. The Roman general was not merely conducting a siege. He was constructing a prison from which escape would be nearly impossible. Before the encirclement was fully completed, Vercingetorix made a bold move. He ordered thousands of his cavalry to ride out through the narrowing gaps in the Roman lines. Their mission was urgent: carry word across Gaul that the decisive moment had arrived. Every tribe, every warrior, every available fighter needed to march toward Alesia if they hoped to break the siege. As those riders disappeared into the distance, both sides understood what was coming. Caesar had built walls that could hold an army captive, but soon he would have to prove those same walls could also hold back an entire nation. As the walls of the Roman siege tightened around the hill fortress, life inside Alesia began to change in ways that no warrior could ignore. What had once been a strong defensive position was slowly becoming a trap. The fortress had never been designed to hold such a massive population. Tens of thousands of warriors had crowded inside its walls, along with families, traders, and civilians who had fled there for safety when the war intensified. At first, many believed the siege would be short. After all, a relief army was already being summoned from across Gaul. Surely the Romans could not hold their lines long enough to starve an entire fortress. But as days passed, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. Food supplies began to dwindle rapidly. The granaries that once seemed sufficient were suddenly feeding far more mouths than they were meant to support. Each day the rations grew smaller. Warriors who had marched confidently into Alesia now found themselves counting every portion of grain and every scrap of preserved meat. Hunger began to spread quietly through the crowded streets and camps inside the fortress. At the center of this growing crisis stood Vercingetorix, the leader who had united the tribes of Gaul in defiance of Rome. He understood that morale was as important as food. If the warriors lost hope before the relief army arrived, the entire rebellion could collapse. So strict rationing was imposed. Each fighter received only a fraction of what had once been considered a normal meal. The priority was clear: the warriors had to survive long enough to fight when the moment came. But the math was merciless. Even with rationing, the supplies would not last forever. Eventually, Vercingetorix faced a brutal decision that would haunt the memory of the siege. The fortress simply contained too many people. If everyone remained inside, starvation would arrive long before any relief army could break the Roman lines. Reluctantly, he ordered the civilians, the elderly, the women, and the children, to leave the fortress. The decision was both strategic and desperate. The hope was that the Romans might allow these non-combatants to pass through their siege lines and escape into the countryside. If they were allowed to leave, the remaining supplies inside Alesia might last long enough for the warriors to hold out. But the reality was far more tragic. When the civilians approached the Roman fortifications, they found the gates closed. Julius Caesar had no intention of allowing them through. Letting them pass would only reduce the pressure on the defenders inside the fortress. Instead, the Roman lines remained sealed. Caught between the walls of Alesia and the outer defenses of the Roman army, thousands of civilians suddenly found themselves trapped in a narrow strip of land that belonged to neither side. They pleaded to be allowed back into the fortress, but the gates remained shut. The defenders inside had already sacrificed them in the hope of survival. And so they remained there, visible to both armies, abandoned in the no-man's land between two forces preparing for one of the most decisive battles of the ancient world. For the warriors inside Alesia, the sight was a constant reminder of what was at stake. Hunger, desperation, and the weight of impossible choices hung over the fortress like a storm. Everyone knew that the relief army had to arrive soon, because if it did not, Alesia would fall not to Roman swords, but to starvation. The moment everyone inside and outside Alesia had been waiting for finally arrived in early autumn. From the high watchtowers along the Roman fortifications, scouts began to see movements spreading across the distant plains. Dust clouds rose along the horizon, and soon the shape of an enormous army came into view. Warriors from tribes across Gaul had answered the call. Tens of thousands, perhaps far more, marched toward the fortress in an attempt to break the siege. For the men trapped inside Alesia, the sight brought a surge of hope. Fires were lit along the walls of the fortress as signals to the approaching force. Across the fields, horns and drums echoed in response. The long-awaited relief army had arrived. But for the Roman legions under Julius Caesar, the moment marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of the entire campaign. Caesar's army now faced a nightmare scenario: enemies both outside and inside the siege lines. If the two forces coordinated their attacks successfully, the Roman defenses could collapse under sheer pressure. The first assault came at dawn. Waves of Gallic warriors surged toward the Roman outer wall, their war cries rolling across the countryside like thunder. As they advanced, they ran straight into the deadly maze Caesar's engineers had prepared. Hidden pits swallowed charging fighters, sharpened stakes tore through shields and legs, and artillery from the Roman towers launched heavy bolts into tightly packed formations. Still, the attackers kept coming. Some managed to reach the trenches and begin filling them with bundles of wood and earth, while others climbed toward the walls with ladders. For hours, brutal fighting raged along the fortifications. Roman soldiers rushed from sector to sector along internal roads, reinforcing weak points as they appeared. The discipline of the legions held firm, and by the end of the day the attackers had been pushed back. But the victory was only temporary. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix had been waiting for exactly this moment. As the relief army pressed against the outer defenses, he launched his own assault from within the fortress. Thousands of warriors poured down the slopes toward the inner Roman walls, carrying ladders, grappling hooks, and whatever tools they could find. Suddenly the Romans were fighting on two fronts at once, defending the outer line against the relief army while also repelling attacks from the trapped garrison. The battlefield descended into chaos. Dust, smoke, and the roar of thousands of men clashing in close combat filled the air. Day after day, the fighting continued. At night, smaller groups of Gauls crept forward under the cover of darkness, attempting to dismantle Roman traps and open paths for larger attacks. Roman sentries listened for the slightest movement, and whenever the alarms were raised, savage skirmishes broke out in the darkness. Then, on the third day, the Gauls discovered what they believed was the key to victory. In the northern sector of the Roman lines, rough terrain had forced the fortifications into a weaker formation. Ravines and uneven ground made it harder to maintain the same dense defensive layout found elsewhere. Gallic commanders saw their opportunity. Before dawn, thousands of selected warriors moved quietly into position near the weak point. At the same time, the main relief army prepared a massive assault against the western wall, designed to draw Roman attention away from the vulnerable sector. When the attacks began, they struck with overwhelming force. The western defenses came under enormous pressure as wave after wave of warriors hurled themselves against the fortifications. Caesar rushed reinforcements toward that sector, knowing the line could not break. But then, from the north, the hidden force erupted from the forests and slammed into the weaker defenses. For a moment, the Roman position seemed to crumble. Enemy warriors began pouring over the walls, pushing exhausted defenders backward. Dust and confusion filled the air as soldiers fought desperately to hold the line. Seeing the danger, Caesar made a decision that would become legendary. Instead of directing the battle from a distance, he rode straight toward the collapsing sector. Wearing his distinctive red cloak, he appeared in the thick of the fighting, rallying his soldiers at the very point where the defenses were breaking. The sight of their commander fighting alongside them ignited a surge of determination among the Roman ranks. Reinforcements poured into the breach, while Caesar ordered a sudden counterattack against the exposed flank of the Gallic force. At the same time, Roman cavalry struck the enemy from another direction, cutting into their rear. What had looked moments earlier like a breakthrough quickly turned into a deadly trap. The attacking warriors found themselves surrounded by disciplined Roman units pressing in from multiple sides. Confusion spread through the Gallic ranks. Orders were lost in the noise and dust of battle. As the pressure mounted, the once coordinated assault began to break apart. Fighters who had believed victory was within reach suddenly realized they were trapped. What began as a controlled retreat quickly became a chaotic flight. Thousands of warriors ran back toward the forests, abandoning the battlefield. From the walls of Alesia, Vercingetorix watched as the relief army dissolved before his eyes. The last hope of breaking the Roman siege had vanished, and with it the fate of Gaul was sealed. As the dust settled around the hills of Alesia, the silence that followed was heavier than the battle itself. The massive relief army that had once filled the plains was gone, scattered across the countryside after their failed assault. Inside the fortress, the situation had become hopeless. Food was gone, the soldiers were exhausted, and the last chance to break the Roman siege had vanished. The fate of the defenders was now unavoidable. In the days that followed, Vercingetorix made the decision that would mark the end of the rebellion. Rather than allow his warriors to slowly starve or be slaughtered in a final desperate attack, he chose surrender. According to ancient accounts, he rode out of the gates of Alesia dressed in his finest armor, mounted on horseback, and approached the camp of Julius Caesar. There, in front of the Roman commander and his officers, he laid down his weapons and gave himself up. For the warriors who had fought beside him, the outcome was grim. Thousands were taken prisoner and eventually sold into slavery, their fate becoming part of the brutal reality of ancient warfare. Yet their resistance had not been meaningless. For a brief moment in history, the tribes of Gaul had stood united against one of the most powerful military systems the world had ever seen. For Rome, the victory was decisive. The siege of Alesia effectively ended large-scale resistance across Gaul. In the years that followed, the region would be absorbed into the Roman world, its culture, trade networks, and cities gradually reshaped under Roman rule. And for Caesar, the victory carried enormous political weight. It strengthened his reputation as one of the greatest commanders of the ancient world and helped pave the road toward the dramatic events that would later reshape the Roman Republic itself. The story of Alesia reminds us that history often turns on moments of extraordinary risk and leadership. One commander gambled everything on walls, discipline, and strategy, and changed the future of Europe. If you enjoy exploring these powerful turning points from world history, make sure to support the channel. Subscribe for more in-depth historical stories, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this battle, and join us as we continue uncovering the moments that shape the world we live in today.